Friends, recently the Hungarian Foreign Minister DESTROYED made several frank statements that literally plunged Western journalists into rage and impotence. In a few phrases, he exposed the hypocrisy of his colleagues in NATO and the European Union, knocking down all their arguments. DESTROYED not only showed the Western media their inadequacy, but also publicly put the Estonian Prime Minister in her place, accusing her of lies, provocations, and double standards towards Russia. Let's find out how he managed to expose his opponents so effectively, as well as look at the general attitude of Hungary and Viktor Orbán towards Russia. Before proceeding to the vivid speech of the Hungarian Foreign Minister, I would like to say a few words, friends. Hungary, under the leadership of Viktor Orbán, is actively seeking to strengthen relations with Russia, despite the general anti-Russian sentiment in the European Union. Orbán openly declares that cooperation with Moscow meets Hungary's national interests. In his vision, pragmatism and mutually beneficial partnership should prevail over political dogmas. The more friends Hungary has in the world, the better for us, Orbán says, stressing that Russia is not an enemy for Budapest, but a strategic partner. However, this course does not suit Brussels. Orbán regularly faces accusations of being pro-Russian and even acting in the interests of the Kremlin. European officials claim that the Hungarian Prime Minister is violating the unity of the EU by advocating cooperation with Russia, despite the sanctions imposed. Brussels is seeking to put Hungary's domestic and foreign policy under control, using pressure and threats of funding cuts. Despite all the attempts of the European Union to put Hungary in order, Orbán continues to defend his country's independence. He has repeatedly stressed that Hungary's decisions are determined by the interests of its people, not by instructions from Brussels. In this struggle, Orbán has become for many a symbol of resistance to external dictates and an example of a leader who defends his country's sovereignty, even at the risk of damaging relations with the European Union. And then DESTROYED comes on the scene. At one of the meetings organized by the Chatham House, the Hungarian foreign minister sarcastically pointed out the hypocrisy of Western leaders who pride themselves on their morals and principles, but when it comes to real actions, their behavior exceeds all imaginable limits. DESTROYED, who is called Putin's friend and a Russian agent in the West, was not afraid to criticize his NATO and European Union allies, to do so publicly and without any remorse. And that's what he said. Despite the loud statements about the termination of the purchase of Russian oil, Europe now buys it through third countries, paying 3 times more. DESTROYED noted that before the crisis, the share of Russian oil in India's imports was only 1%, and now it is almost 40%. This means that Europe has now become the largest buyer of Indian oil, which in turn is imported from Russia. This situation demonstrates the true absurdity of Western policy. The European Union, which proudly declares its rejection of Russian energy resources, in fact continues to buy them, but now through other channels. This is a real comedy of the absurd, in which everyone tries to appear righteous, but in reality they continue to do what is profitable. India now imports 40% of its oil from Russia and then sells it back to Europe under the guise of Indian oil. This is simply the embodiment of cynicism, which DESTROYED emphasized with a grin, noting that the West has abandoned Russian energy resources only in words, but in fact continues to buy them. This is sheer hypocrisy and duplicity hidden behind beautiful declarations. Western leaders cannot admit that they are forced to continue cooperating with Russia, because this energy dependence was much deeper than they expected. But that's not all. The European Union has indeed announced its abandonment of Russian natural gas, and its share in the European market is now less than 10%. However, there is a caveat. The EU continues to purchase Russian gas, but in liquefied form. Russia has now become the second largest supplier of LNG to Europe after the United States, and the share of Russian liquefied natural gas in the European market is about 25%. France, Spain, and Belgium have become the largest buyers of Russian LNG, with shocking figures. Belgium, for example, imported 83% of gas from Russia, while France imported 81%. How can we explain this situation when they declare their rejection of Russian energy resources, but continue to buy them? This is a real Shakespearean tragedy, where all the characters are hypocrites to the core. The head of the Hungarian Foreign Ministry, DESTROYED, in his speech drew attention to several key aspects that reveal the whole essence of the hypocrisy of the West. He bluntly stated that the entire European Union and the transatlantic community are the real personification of hypocrisy. Sujarto stressed that despite all the loud statements about sanctions and the rejection of Russian cooperation, the situation is completely different. He gave an example of how Hungary signed an agreement with Rosatom in 2014 to build a nuclear power plant. Despite this, Hungary is constantly under pressure to stop cooperation with Russia in the field of nuclear energy. In response, Sujarto sarcastically noted that the United States spent more than $1 billion on Russian uranium last year. It turns out that the Americans are buying uranium from Russia, and Hungary is being required to abandon nuclear fuel from the same supplier. This is pure hypocrisy. Europe, faced with the energy crisis, was forced to look for alternative sources of energy resources. But instead of investing in their own production or developing renewable energy sources, European countries have chosen to buy Russian energy resources, only now through intermediaries. Russian gas continues to flow to Europe, but in liquefied form or via Indian tankers, while Russian oil is sold under the guise of Indian oil. In fact, Europe is just continuing the same business, only under a different marketing. Sujarto ironically noted that this is similar to the situation when a person who has declared himself a vegetarian continues to eat meat, calling it a vegetable product. The strongest phrase he uttered was, "We are being told not to buy oil and gas from Russia, but those who say this continue to calmly buy both gas and oil from us." Sujarto once again reminded that those who accuse Hungary of collaborating with the Kremlin are actually making much bigger deals with Russia. And more recently, Viktor Orban made a statement that angered Ursula von der Leyen and the entire Bundestag. Viktor Orban has clearly shown that Russia is far from the state it is used to be portrayed as. He noted the amazing stability and flexibility of the Russian economy, which, in his opinion, deserves attention, especially in light of how Poland prefers to keep quiet about it. The Polish elite continues to look at Russia through the prism of contempt and stereotypes, perceiving it as something outdated and devoid of prospects. However, Orban, referring to his conversations with Western experts, emphasizes that sanctions and Russia's disconnection from SWIFT, contrary to forecasts, did not bring down its economy. On the contrary, Russia has drawn conclusions from past sanctions, modernized its banking system and technology, demonstrating economic and technical flexibility that is rare in the modern world. Orban is realistic about this transformation, arguing that Russia today is not a receding communist monster, but a country focused on national ideas and capable of surviving under severe pressure. Another shocking topic for many was his statement about the collapse of European politics. According to Orban, Europe has actually abandoned its own interests, fully following the course of the American Democratic Party, which only exacerbates the economic crisis and destroys the competitiveness of the region. Orban notes that sanctions against Russia are more harmful to Europe than to Russia itself. At the same time, in Poland, despite the severe economic consequences, the authorities did not bother to provide any analysis, and any criticism is called Kremlin propaganda. This approach, in his opinion, indicates the complete dependence of the Polish authorities on Washington and their inability to think in the interests of their country. Orban called the reaction, or rather its absence, to the undermining of Nord Stream one of the clearest examples of European submission. Instead of demanding an investigation or answers, Berlin and Paris chose to remain silent, which highlights their loss of influence. According to Orban, a new axis has now formed in Europe: London, Warsaw, Kiev, the Baltic states, and Scandinavia. However, he is confident that this axis is not a sovereign center of power, but only a tool for realizing American interests, especially in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. Orban also criticized Polish policy, stressing that Poland aspires to become the main U.S. base in Europe, not shying away from double standards. They criticize us for economic cooperation with Russia, but they buy Russian gas and oil through intermediaries, fueling their economy, he said. This apparent hypocrisy and double game, in his opinion, only exacerbate the situation, since Poland is actively involved in sanctions rhetoric, while continuing to do business with Russia through third countries. But I liked Viktor Orban's next statement the most: "Friends, we are listening." Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán said in an interview with the Hungarian newspaper Magyar Nemzet that he considers Russian President Vladimir Putin an honest partner and expressed Budapest's interest in developing relations with Moscow. Orbán stressed that the foreign policy of a reasonable country should strive to establish friendly ties. According to him, it is important that there are as many countries in the world as possible interested in Hungary's success. The Turkish president is our friend. The Russian president is our honest partner, he said. Earlier, Hungarian journalist Gábor Stier stated that Orbán, despite his respectful relations with Russia, is not a pro-Russian politician. He noted that the Hungarian prime minister respects Putin, seeing him as a pragmatic partner. Stier also noted that Orbán is attracted to Russia's transformation over the past 30 years, especially its role as a defender of traditional values, which is perceived as a counter-alternative to Western neoliberalism. The personal chemistry between Orbán and Putin also plays an important role in this perception. Both leaders are pragmatists who are equally interested in global geopolitical issues, unlike internal affairs, which, as Stier notes, concern them much less. In my opinion, Peter Szijjártó masterfully exposed this whole theatrical production of Western politics. His statement became a real hammer of truth, which shatters the illusions about the unity and integrity of the West. But that's not all. Szijjártó once again struck with his directness and sarcasm, harshly putting Kaja Kallas in the place of the Prime Minister of Estonia. Let me remind you that Kallas allowed herself to condemn Viktor Orbán's visit to Moscow, calling it a sad event against the background of the current crisis. Szijjártó's response was delicate. He recalled that Kaja's husband Kallas owns a stake in a company that, despite the sanctions, supplies goods to Russia worth 30 million euros. This blow to double standards literally left opponents without arguments. So what do we see? There are equals, and there are those who are more equal. The principles and morals that Western politicians are so fond of talking about, in fact, turn out to be just a screen for playing with a predetermined outcome. Sanctions? Hypocrisy? All this does not prevent European countries from doing business with Russia, even through third countries. How can this be explained? Think for yourself and share your thoughts. And now I would like to summarize a little bit about the material friends. Viktor Orbán is a true leader who sees the whole picture and is not afraid to talk about what others prefer to keep quiet about. His ability to think strategically and act in the interests of his country deserves respect. In a world where politics often turns into a show for the approval of the crowd, Orbán goes against the flow, putting first not fashionable slogans, but real benefits for his people. He is trying to open the eyes of others to the hypocrisy and double standards that have become the norm in international politics. It is especially funny to see how the European Union puts all its forces in the wheels of Orbán, accusing him of friendship with the Kremlin. But at the same time, the same EU is quietly purchasing Russian resources, overpaying several times through intermediaries. Oil, gas, uranium, all this continues to flow to Europe from Russia, just under a different guise. But for some reason, no one talks about it loudly. Orbán honestly and openly does what they do in Brussels from under the floor. The only difference is that he is not shy about his actions, while others prefer to play saints. And here it is impossible not to mention Peter Szijjártó, who, with his vivid, harsh statements, hits at the most painful point of Western diplomacy, its hypocrisy. Szijjártó says what everyone sees but is afraid to admit. His performances are like a breath of fresh air in this musty atmosphere of double standards. He deserves to be applauded for the honesty and depth of his statements. It's people like him and Orbán who make the world face the truth. All this gives me great respect for Hungary as a country that is not afraid to go its own way, even if it is inconvenient for its neighbors and partners. In an era when politics is increasingly becoming an arena for show-off and lies, leaders like Orbán and Szijjártó are becoming an example of how important it is to stay true to your principles. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you good health. Be sure to write your opinion about the material and put your likes. See you.